Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So we're starting a new unit on basically the modern world. What we're going to talking about today is globalization and how very quickly the entire Earth has, while the Earth itself hasn't changed, the human populations absolutely has. And it has really forced the entire world to work together whether or not they want to or not. And this is a huge change from the previous existence of the human populations. Cool stuff to talk about. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So this whole unit on the modern world, not surprising, it talks about a lot of current events and what our modern world looks like. Unlike the Renaissance or, even imperialism or colonization, the world today is very different because it is highly populated. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit here to start today. But with the large population, you can't avoid other humans and other cultures and other people. So because of that, it forces societies to work together. And societies and cultures that are different working together are kind of forced to at least deal with or experience other people's differences and try to compartmentalize them in kind of one world culture. And I feel like in our current era, we're starting to see the very beginnings of a world culture. So that's what we're going to start talking about today is globalization and this concept of interdependence. All right. So we need to talk about population though. This is a graph of the world population over the last 12,000 years, since the earliest scientific understanding of the beginnings of humans. If you notice, it was like very small amount of people across the entire Earth, all right? All the way up, so about the time, the year zero, the time era that Jesus was on Earth, you had about 190 million people on the entire planet. That really doesn't change a whole lot until about 300 or 400 years ago, and it absolutely skyrockets. So the history of the world and societies and how humans interact is really stressed now with the massive amount of people in existing systems. So we're having to change those systems. So let me give you another graph here because I know that just spiked. This is from the year 1700 of this growth. So across the entire world, it took 12,000 years. 12,000 years for the human population to go from 0 people to 1 billion in the year 1800. Present day, or in a couple years, this is being recorded in 2022. So by 2024, it is expected that there will be 8 billion people on Earth. So it took 12,000 years to get to 1 billion, and then 200 years to get 7 additional billion to that. And it is spread out all over the world. It's not clumped up in one place. China, as of 2018, has 1.4 billion. India, 1.3 billion. Throughout Europe, there's very densely populated countries. None of them are in the billions. Africa, hundreds of millions of people in Africa. The United States has 326 million people. Mexico has 130 million. This graph right here kind of shows by the size of the circle is how populated the countries are. Now, why has this happened? Well, that's what I want to explain to you, because to understand this massive population and why it has changed so quickly, we need to understand why this has happened. Now, I want to show you a stat here that might be counterintuitive. So as the population skyrockets, you might be thinking, well, I guess people are having more babies, right? Actually, it's the opposite of that. Since 1950, worldwide, the fertility rate. Now, that doesn't mean how many children people can have. It's how many people they're kind of choosing. Like, how many kids do they have? So has drastically dropped. But in 1950, people had an average of fertility rate of 5 kids. Women had an average of 5 kids. An average of 5 kids in 1950. You got grandparents, great grandparents. They probably have a lot of siblings. All right. However, over time, people start having less and less kids. Wait a minute, Mr. Wagstaff. How is there a bigger population if people are having less kids? Glad you asked that, because that's the important thing. One of the reasons that people stopped having so many kids is the earth is so populated, it is very expensive to have kids, as opposed to 100 years ago, and the kids helped run the farm and things like that. Society has changed because of the population, and people don't have as many kids. And you're like, okay, Mr. Wagstaff, that's not answering my question. How are there more people if people are having less kids? Well, because people aren't dying. People are still being born, maybe at a lesser rate, but people are dying a lot less frequently than they used to. There are 3 things that historically have kept populations in check throughout the history of humanity. War, famine, disease. Those 3 things. Let's talk about those in the modern society. Let's talk about war. All right. So, this map here is from 1400. All right. These are the global deaths, not percentages, total amounts of people that are dying in conflicts over a long period of time. If you notice here, all right, that really by the end of World War II, all right, by 1950, it just plummets. Now, you can make a whole lot of arguments here that this is when nuclear weapons came out and it was a deterrent for going to war, so people stopped fighting altogether with the fear of nukes, all right? However, one nuclear war would make this graph skyrocket pretty quick. So people aren't really dying at the large rates in war, which is one of the things that kept population in check for a long period of time, as they previously have. The next one is famine. This has a lot to do with science. You can grow food pretty much anywhere with the right science and know-how and understanding of how soil works and irrigation. And because there's a larger population, as the very first human civilizations, it was all based on fresh water and food. When food increases, populations increase. So once science figured out how to make genetically modified food and made things grow faster, better, drought resistant, and the mass amount of food around the world is common and is available, you don't have people starving to death. There are still people starving to death, which is an issue in our world, mainly because that should never happen. We throw away way more food than we could ever use now as a human population, yet there still are people starving to death on Earth. However, in the macro sense, the amount of people that are suffering from famine, which we'll talk about that later on in this unit, in those specific situations, it is such a small percentage of the world population that it doesn't impact the population growth. So really, since the 1950s, people dying of famine has plummeted. So you might be asking me, once again, okay, but why? There's so many few people being born. I understand they're not dying. But why is the population continuing to rise if less people are being born? We're going back to science here. So that graph of, everybody in the 1950s or before having 5 kids, kids died often. They would get sick. Young children's immune systems aren't that strong. They would get sick and die. It was extremely common to have at least one child die of some horrible disease or sickness prior to really the 20th century. As shocking as that is, kind of shows the point here. It's shocking because a lot of people couldn't comprehend that because they don't see it. Because the life expectancy and the infant mortality rate has dropped. It means there's not a lot of kids that die before their 5th birthday by comparison to the way it used to be due to science. Kids get sick, there's medicine to help them survive, and once you hit the 5th birthday, generally your immune system's pretty much ready to go. People aren't dying so people might have had 5 kids, they may not have all survived. Now people have 2 kids, typically they will survive. So the birth rate might be lower, but since the infant mortality rate, the amount of kids that die, has also dropped, it's really not as drastic of a difference in the amount of humans that grow into adults. Because of that, it has increased the life expectancy. When people die at 5 years old, obviously that drops the average life expectancy. People are living longer. Not only does the same medicine that helps young people with weakened immune systems survive, it helps older people with weakened immune systems survive. I mean, it was in the 1950s, all right? In the world, all right, the average life expectancy was 45 years old. Now, that has a lot to do with World War II, understandably, all right? And 60 years ago, the life expectancy was 45. Today, world average is 71 years old. In America, it's almost 80 years old, which is up almost over a decade across the board. So people are living longer. You have more people here. Now, people are still going to die because people don't live forever. So this is another important one that I think is interesting, is the leading causes of death. And this is just looking at 2016. Number 1 leading cause of death in the world is cardiovascular disease. All right, heart attacks and your heart stopping to work, which could be, that's old age. It's also obesity, smoking, unhealthy lifestyles. The number 1 cause of death being cardiovascular disease, and a large chunk of cardiovascular disease is based on lifestyle choices as opposed to wars and things like that. There are respiratory diseases, diabetes, dementia, these other situations. You have to go all the way down to near the bottom of this list to road injuries. Car accidents is the number 1 cause of any type of, I guess you would call that like a violent death. And that's 2.5% per the percentages that are based here. Whereas previously, it was bear attack or something, there's always something crazy that would happen. But the causes of death are so much less than what they were. Again, the death by region of children under 5 has plummeted over time. So this is why the entire society has drastically changed, because there are so many more people that exist. All the countries are busting at the seams in population, and you have to work with other countries because everybody needs natural resources. Everybody has to depend on each other for the billions of people on Earth to survive, which brings to global interdependence. Countries rely on other countries now. And it makes for a whole different world. You can't just be mean and take your ball and go home and ignore the rest of the world. North Korea, as of this is being recorded, is the closest thing that we have in the world of trying to do that, and absolutely devastating for their country to try to ignore the rest of the world. Because of the population increases, you have to depend on other people. Probably the thing that hits America most close to home when it comes to interdependence is because we have so many people, we have large needs for energy, as we have talked about in a previous lesson. The oil industry and America's need on oil really is predicated on America's relationship with the Middle East. So the Middle East, which has a very different culture, a lot of different societies than America, America is intricately involved on it, because if a conflict happens in the Middle East on the other side of the world of a country that most Americans would never visit, it can fundamentally change American day-to-day life with gas prices and shipping costs and the way we run our life. And that has come up because of the massive population increases that have happened in the world, in which since the 1950s in which everybody has to find a way to work together, and one person's problem very quickly can cascade and affect other people at the same time. So the question here is, what has changed recently, meaning in the last 50, 60 years, that has necessitated the growth of globalization? Obviously, we're talking about population here. So explain to me why population growth has necessitated the growth of globalization. And also explain to me why population has grown. Some of the things that we talked about there. Why just now that the population on Earth has just skyrocketed. All right. So when everybody has to be involved with each other, there are different ways in which this can be viewed. Some people view globalization as good. Some view it as bad. All right. Depending on how you look at it, because it is a very complex society, world society that we live in. So when one country needs something, they will buy it from another country that's making it. That seems simple on the surface. However, it can be complicated morally. So let's walk through that. So here's some positive effects of globalization. All right. So America wants a bunch of stuff. So America, all right, wants to buy it from another country that's making it. All right. This is globalization. We're interconnected with other countries. We might even ask the other country, hey, I know you don't make this product, but would y'all mind making that product for us, and then we will buy it from you? This is very common, and we're going to start talking about this quite a bit here. So this is the idea of outsourcing, to where, and I think the example I'll have here is Pakistan. America will ask Pakistan, hey, we need soccer balls. Will you make America soccer balls? And we will buy them from you. This benefits a lot of people. America has somebody to make the soccer balls. And Pakistan's happy to do it because it gives them employment. All right. We are going to pay them. They have a job. They're getting paid. They're doing something. They're shipping it off. It seems on the surface that it benefits everybody. And in a lot of ways it does. The workforce around the world has steadily risen due to outsourcing. All right. And being involved in other countries. Generally speaking, whichever standard you look at, if you want to look at the standard of living for countries around the world, has generally gone up. Standard of living is subjective. Like, what is a better living environment? And that kind of depends where you are on Earth. Like, it would be, if you live in a really hot climate, probably having air conditioner would be a big positive. But if you live in the Arctic, having air conditioning wouldn't matter at all because you would never use it. So it's kind of subjective on country to country, so I couldn't find one single graph. But GDP, the production and the average amount of income each country is getting, has collectively gone up over time in goods and services. So it does appear on surface that, hey, America buying soccer balls from Pakistan is good for everybody, right? Well, I'm specifically want to use that example with soccer balls because I want to make a focused point here. If Pakistan isn't making the soccer balls, or if Pakistan does make the soccer balls, you know who's not making the soccer balls? American workers. So American workers are no longer being the ones that make the soccer balls. People in Pakistan are. Specifically, we're talking about Nike and their soccer balls. So Nike uses, and they got in trouble with it. They changed this because it's what we're talking about it now. It was kind of a big, they were using child labor in Pakistan to make soccer balls. They would pay 60 cents a day for a child to make soccer balls. All right. I would imagine the child makes more than one soccer ball a day. Child gets 60 cents a day. This is in the 1990s, all right, when this became common. Nike then turns around and sells those soccer balls All right, I got a list here, and again, these are older prices. I bet you can find them more. This soccer ball is $150. That's what Nike sells it for. They pay a kid in Pakistan 60 cents a day, and then turn around and sell that product he's making for $150. Now, could Nike clearly pay that child a lot more money? Absolutely. Should Nike probably not take kids away from school and make them go work in a factory and basically limit their growth potential? Absolutely. And so it's real easy to throw stones here at Nike and say, hey, Nike, that's wrong. You can't do that. And obviously Nike aware of it. We're picking on them here specifically for this specific scenario. A lot of these big companies are guilty of this. But that kid, maybe he was starving. Maybe that kid's family was. And by getting a job actually does increase his current life expectancy, his standard of living. Now, if you're like Mr. Wagstaff, that just seems like you're enabling awful treatment of other people. People have very different societies than we have and a value system. Obviously, the fact that this is being taught in a survey course about Nike and these soccer balls, this is kind of a cut and dry one where that was inappropriate, and Nike knows that. But Nike isn't going to turn around and go pay an American worker minimum wage to do it, because minimum wage is $7, $8 an hour at this point, if not more, when they can pay somebody from another poor country a lot less money to make the same product. All right. So some of the downsides to outsourcing is that not only does it seem American companies are paying people in other countries below American standards, it also prevents possible workers in America from doing those same jobs. But this is not a right or wrong thing. This is your opinion of your view of it. So the question here is, how do poor and rich countries find a way to work together in a global economy? I mean, like America and Pakistan, the example that we used. Is this fair? And is this good or bad? That's not really a trick question. There's no right and wrong answer on that. What is your opinion on that situation? So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. So with this idea of outsourcing, and you can hire workers in another part of the world to make the same product cheaper than Americans, because this is being taught in America, so we use America as a central hub for this. There's a lot of corporations that exist around the world, and they are called multinational corporations. Corporations that are in multiple countries, like McDonald's or Nike I just talked about. Pretty much all the big companies now are in all the big corporations are in different countries now. I'll use CocaCola because Coca-Cola is one of the largest companies on earth, and everybody around the world enjoys Coca-Cola. All right. In China, they have their own Coke factory. The Coke factory is in Atlanta. And the one in America, I'm sure there's multiple in America, but the headquarters is in Atlanta, Georgia. What's interesting, and I got this picture here of the Coke cans from abroad, and you can see how it's all Coke, but it's all different. It doesn't all say Coca-Cola. What's really interesting, and I learned this when I took a tour of the Coca-Cola plant in Atlanta, Georgia, that every country has a different culture. They grow up with different foods, different tastes, and they like things differently than different countries. What tastes really good to somebody in Russia might not taste good to somebody in Zimbabwe, and it's just a matter of preference of how they grew up. Well, Coca-Cola knows this, and based on the country that Coca-Cola is sold in, it tastes different. So the Coca-Cola you'll buy at the store here is American Coca-Cola. And depending on where you are in the world, Coca-Cola has changed their flavor of their soda in that part of the world to suit the people there. And if I only learned this because you go to the Coca-Cola headquarters in Georgia, and they have like a whole massive room with all the different flavors from around the world. And they're some of them are just a little bit different and you can't really taste it. And then some of them are like drastically different. Now, when you're an international corporation, like you're Coca-Cola, yes, there's a factory in China that makes Coca-Cola for China. However, everybody knows that's an American company. So this picture right here is a poster protesting Coca-Cola in Pakistan. All right. In Palestine. I shouldn't have misspoke. Very, very different. Palestine, as we talked about in a previous unit, Palestine and Israel struggle for the same territory in what is present day identified as Israel. Knowing that Coca-Cola is an American company, this is a poster encouraging people to boycott Coca-Cola so that America knows that the Palestinians are upset with American involvement in Israel. When you are a private company and you're a multinational corporation, you still, whether you want to or not, represent America and can deal with backlashes to American foreign policy, even as a private company, because you are identified as American as any other individual company could that's a multinational corporation. So there's a lot of responsibility of representing your country on a national scale when you're a multinational corporation. So the question here is, what is a multinational organization and how can that affect a company? So if you're just selling products here, if you're Coca-Cola and you're just selling it in this region, just in America, there's a certain way you can conduct yourself and you're fine because you don't have to deal with one culture. When you become a multinational corporation and you sell your product all over the world, what are some of the other issues that you're going to have to deal with in order to sell your product worldwide and make a bigger profit? What's some of the other things that come along with that? And we just talked about it a little bit. So pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. So trade worldwide, very important, becomes very, very intricate and necessary. So much so that in the 1990s, there is this thing created called the World Trade Organization, which helps monitor and make sure trade is fair between all the countries around the world. They don't really have an authority to stop trade that much, but it's kind of like the United Nations when it comes to trade and regulating and trying to make sure everything is as fair as possible. So the World Trade Organization really oversees everything. They don't necessarily have their hand in everything, but they do oversee it and makes a lot of determinations on what is fair between countries. While the World Trade Organization affects the world, what's more pertinent to countries are things that are called trade blocs. Basically, groups of countries that trade not necessarily exclusively with the ones right next to them, but countries that basically give favorable trade agreements to the countries right next to them. Without going through all these, let's focus on the American one here from this map, NAFTA. So the American trade bloc is called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which says anything made in Mexico, America, or Canada can be shipped to Mexico, America, or Canada and sold without any import tax. All right, so it'd be the same thing as making it in your own country. This was designed, all right, basically to help all the economies involved and be able to trade easier with these three countries without a lot of interference. This is a picture of Bill Clinton signing it into law in 1994. Well, what people didn't realize, even though people said this is what's going to happen, and they're like, no, it won't, and then it does, there's a big debate on NAFTA. Because when NAFTA is passed in 1994, pretty quickly after that, American manufacturing jobs plummeted. Lexington, North Carolina is a good example. They had a lot of furniture making areas in Lexington, North Carolina. As soon as the owners of the factories in Lexington, North Carolina realized, wait a minute, I could pay Johnny here $12 an hour to make chairs, all right, or I could just move my whole factory to Mexico, pay a Mexican factory worker $4 an hour to make the same chair, ship it back, no import tax, and so they're in this trade bloc NAFTA, and then I can sell it for the same price and make a bigger profit. That's what happens. And even when China enters the WTO, even more so with this graph, American manufacturing jobs leaves because Americans are very expensive to pay. We have a very high standard of living. It costs a lot of money to pay Americans. So when these trade blocks are created, a lot of these manufacturing jobs go to either Mexico or they go to China, or we'll stick with NAFTA here. They go to Mexico, and puts a lot of Americans out of work, and they have to completely change the way they've done things because there's no factory jobs left. 5 million people lose their jobs. All right, overtime. Manufacturing jobs doesn't mean they're unemployed, but they lose their manufacturing jobs. Being so wildly unpopular, right? You would think so. By 2017, surely they realized this is a bad idea. In 2017, Donald Trump re-signs the NAFTA agreement, extending it. There are some changes in it, but pretty much it reaffirms NAFTA as beneficial. So the question is, what is the controversy around NAFTA in America? Why do you think it was extended under President Trump if American job loss was associated with it after President Clinton signed it into law in 1994? Well, I'll tell you. Because you know who made a lot of money? Is the factory owners. The rich people made tons of money because their profits increased. NAFTA, while it hurts poor people, it benefits America's GDP, the overall amount of money coming into the United States. So this is one of the reasons it gets signed back into law. What you're starting to see in modern societies is a growing gap between the rich and the poor, which historically has always existed, but when it gets too much, and I think we're far away from this, but when it gets too much, there usually ends up being a very strong counter reaction to that. All right, so answer that completely. That's as far as we'll get today. See y'all tomorrow.